They say there was a time when the stars sang, when the emperor walked among men and his sons carried light into the void. But light always casts a shadow. Listen, and let your breath find the slow rhythm of distant engines. Imagine a galaxy held like a careful lantern in a gentle hand, a lantern big enough to hold 1 billion worlds and feel, for a moment, the hush that falls when someone reads aloud beside the glow. In that hush, there was a promise. It was the promise of a single, unwavering will, a dream of unity that could stitch the torn skin of a broken universe back together. They called it the Imperium then, and for a time, its name tasted like warmth on the tongue of the lost. Close your eyes and picture the first fleet. Not the crude convoys of refugees and scavengers that crawl now through ruined warpways, but a procession of steel and light that moved with the inevitability of tides. Great ships that gleamed like fallen moons, silvered hulls, banners like slow comets trailing behind, drifting through the ink of space, as if the dark itself wanted to part to let them pass. There was music there if you knew how to listen. The soft thrum of reactors, the distant harmonics of drives, the whisper of tendrils of frost across observation domes. It was not a hymn but a lullaby of progress. It hummed of rebuilding, of hands taken and hands given, of gardens planted in soil that had not seen a seed in 1,000 years. And then there were those who carried the light, not priests of temples alone, nor governors in marble halls, but warriors calm, assured, somehow tender in the way they wore their oath. The Luna wolves strode across the galaxy like a measured heartbeat, brothers in arms with faces half hidden beneath the shadow of helmets, voices that could cut through panic and mend it with a single order. They were not worshipped with incense and supplication. They were trusted. People left their children in their care, and the children would sleep easier for it. When a Luna wolf walked through a town, the air seemed to remember how to breathe. At the center of that light stood Horus. Not a god, not a tyrant, a name that was spoken the way one speaks of a beloved uncle, a captain of a ship you once sailed on, a friend whose laugh you still remember. There was warmth in the memory of him. The way he tilted his head before giving counsel, the tired smile that followed a victory, the small, human gestures that made him less a myth and more a man. He was given command because he was worthy, and the men who followed him did so because they believed in the man as much as in the cause. His presence lowered the fever of fear. His laugh could seem like sunlight through a high window. Think now of campfires beneath alien skies, warriors sitting with helmets off, letting the salt of whatever seas they'd crossed dry on their faces. There is a softness in these pictures, hands that once held bolters now threading a child's hair, a pause to tell a story about a world that smelled of apple trees. This is important. Remember the small things. The small things are the places where sorrow hides when it grows. The Imperium of that time was not immaculate. It had the familiar jagged scars of politics and hard choices. But there was a coherence to those choices, an ordered geometry that suggested, against the backdrop of entropy, that someone was keeping the ledger. The Emperor was the constant, a presence like a stone at the heart of a river, diverting currents and smoothing jagged stones to form the path. His decrees were like bedtime rules, clear, absolute, made to keep sleepers safe. In the hush that followed his decisions, entire systems learned to sleep without fear. They laid down in the shadow of his will and dreamed. In the quiet of those dreams, the Luna wolves performed their duties with a solemn tenderness. They were not merely tools of conquest, but guardians of a fragile human dream. The belief that survival could be more than the scraping of teeth and the burning of wood. Under their watch, cities that had almost forgotten how to rise again took root. Children who had only known the echo of explosions learned the cadence of reading. Even the stars seemed less hostile, as if the sight of disciplined fleets crossing the void soothed something primal in the black. But remember that every lantern throws a shadow, and every lullaby holds within it the possibility of waking. There were whispers then, small as the sound of coins falling in an empty hall. The warp, that fevered sea beyond the known currents, sent back currents like cold breaths against the hulls of the great ships. Subtle at first, a sailor who claimed to have dreamed of a face in the smoke, a priest who woke from prayer to find his hands smudged not with soot, but with rust that looked like veins. Scholars wrote these things down and put them in bound ledgers. Captains folded them into their plans and dismissed them as superstition. People want their sleep, and while someone watches the road, there is a temptation to close one's eyes. Horus felt these currents too, but he felt them with a man's empathy, not with a prophet's distance. He would lean his head onto the table and consider maps all night, frown lines like furrows of a field. He listened to his brothers complain about the cold of the void, and the way the stars sometimes seemed to flicker like candles that had been snuffed by invisible hands. Rather than scorn those whispers, he soothed them. All storms pass, he would say. We patch the hole, we mend what breaks. There is something winning in that tenderness. It made him not only a leader but a vessel of the people's relief. They invested him with trust the way they invest a favorite lullaby, thinking if they repeat it enough the world will be gentled. And for a while, perhaps, it was enough. Empires, even fragile ones, can lean on a single dream. The Luna wolves moved like a tide of soft gray armor, returning order to places where chaos had set up camps. They extinguished small fires by command, brokered quiet truces so farmers could plant, and turned ships that once flew by as marauders into escorts for caravans of seed and medicine. They wore their history like a cloak, scars and medals and whispered feats stitched into the fabric of their renown. There was a poetry to their violence, a belief that if warfare could be an art, then there was dignity to be salvaged even in conflict. There is also, within all of this, an understated cruelty to the idea of idealism. For when you trust a single dream with everything you have, you become susceptible to the small fractures in that dream, the hairline cracks that form at its edges. A dream that binds so tightly will not shrink to fit a changed world without tearing something in the process. And in the crevices of those tears, foundations are exposed. Old debts and resentments, the small quiet needs of those who are overlooked, the cold calculation of men who say, if we cannot have the whole lantern, we will have light enough for ourselves. Horus learned this too. He learned not through revelation, but through the accumulation of small disappointments. There were generals who took liberties with orders. There were governors who hoarded grain for their own families while fleets bled for supplies. These acts of private theft and cowardice, insignificant in isolation, accumulated like frost. They cooled Horus's faith like wind stripping heat from a lamp. He began to look at the ledger with a new ironness. He read between the lines and saw not the tidy architecture of a healed empire, but a mosaic of half-truths and promises spoken only when convenient. And yet Horus did not become a monster out of spite. He became tragic in the precise human way that tragedy is born, by loving an ideal so fiercely that he would not allow it to be tarnished. He wanted perfection for the Imperium, not because he was cruel, but because he could not abide the sight of suffering when he could, with the clarity of his will, move mountains to stop it. In that hunger for an unblemished world there is the seed of ruin, for to force perfection is to discard the messy, living things that make a world real. Imagine now a quiet hall, candles guttering, maps spread across an oaken table. Horus's hand, calloused, steady, moves across those maps like a conductor's. Gentle voices around him offer counsel. Armored shoulders shift. Helmets are set aside in deferential care. He smiles, but it is the kind of smile that carries the weight of too many decisions. There is a tenderness in it still, a softness like a hand laid on a child's hair. Those who loved him believed this was the face of a savior. Those who watched more closely saw the strain at the edges of his jaw. It is in the small moments that the heart of the tragic hero is revealed. Horus sat one night in a small observation alcove, his face lit by the greenish glow of navigational beacons. There was a recording playing, voices from a world he had helped save children singing, a lullaby in a dialect he had learned to speak. For a moment the sound carried him back to the earliest days, when dreams were still plain and large like harvested grain. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to remember laughter that had nothing to do with orders. He allowed himself the thought that perhaps one day the empire would be more than survival. It would be gentle again. Somewhere beyond that observation window, the warp breathed against the hull. It is difficult to explain the warp to a sleeping audience, not with facts, but with sensation. Imagine a wind that carries voices not yet said, a fog that tastes of memory, a pressure that makes your teeth ache. Some nights the whispering would be just noise, the sea-song of lunars, the static of children playing at the edge of a dream. Other nights it was more precise, like someone calling a name you had almost forgotten. Horus heard it. All of them did. But they were still men who could choose to look away. And then the subtle changes began. A word misremembered in a poem. An extra beat where a drum should be. A captain who had been the bravest in a dozen engagements confesses, under his breath, that he has woken with the smell of burning that is not present in the room. A prayer that once brought calm now leaves a taste of metal on the tongue. These are thin threads to notice, easily dismissed by those who prefer sleep. But to a man who has sworn to banish suffering, they are like nails under a tread, uncomfortable, then impossible to ignore. Horus did not flee from these nails. He set his jaw and pressed forward. He searched for answers in the ledgers and in the faces of those who served him. He listened to whispers meant for him alone, mechanics who spoke in ratios no ordinary ear would parse, priests who murmured of omens they could not frame. He did not recoil. He collected these strays of thought and tried to weave them into something coherent. In his hands, worry became a plan. Sorrow became strategy. If you let your breathing slow now, let the image of that plan settle, the care with which a man arranges the pieces of a puzzle, because he believes that a perfect picture will restore the world to its remembered shape. In the warmth of that belief there is limitlessness. The Luna Wolves rallied. They did not merely defend, they held councils, they built, they reasoned. It is a gentle dignity to wish for a better world with the ferocity of those who have seen too much to be content with mere compromise. But nowhere in this gentle cadence of repair could Horus, or anyone, foresee the shape of a shadow that was not merely absence of light but a presence, a thing that slid in at the seams of the dream, a shadow that learned the dreamer's lullabies and hummed them back slightly out of tune, and which, over nights and weeks, grew more confident. In the corridors behind empires, in the softening of a prayer's cadence, in the small misalignments of a compass, the warp, the other side of what they trusted, watched and amused itself. So let the last of this chapter be a closing of the book in a hand that is not careless. Picture the Luna Wolves in procession again, their banners catching a faint nebular breeze, their voices like distant bells. See Horus among them, his silhouette caught in the starlight, not monstrous, not yet broken, simply human, noble, flawed, determined. Hear the lullaby his followers hum, a tune of victory and of mending. Feel the comfort it brings. And then, as you drift, carry with you a small, cool unease. Not yet terror, not yet sorrow, only the knowledge that somewhere beyond the singing stars, the wind has shifted. The lantern of the Imperium glows steadily still, and the Luna Wolves march beneath it, their boots making soft rhythms on the deck. But in the places where paint flakes and metal breathes, thin black veins begin to spider outward. A whisper slips where once there was a promise. Hold that whisper like a bookmark. When the next chapter opens, the pages will be darker, the melody will change its key. For now, sleep with the memory of light, and remember that the most terrible things often begin with the softest of hands. They say there was a time when the stars sang, when the emperor walked among men, and his sons carried light into the void. But light always casts a shadow. When you think of the Luna Wolves, do not first conjure thunder or the clangor of battle. Think instead of a single human hand, steady and sure, placing a sapling in a ruined courtyard. Think of men who knew the poetry of patience, the patient tilt of a brow that learned to weigh a life against a campaign, the patience of boots that tread gently across a field where children were sowing. Pride is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet confidence of a shield raised without trembling. Sometimes it is the way soldiers will let a woman cross a road first, because they know the road's dangers better than she does. The Luna Wolves carried themselves like that. They were an ordered thing in a galaxy fraying at the edges. Their banners were not merely standards but promises stitched into cloth, a vow to the weak, a reminder to the strong that mercy was not weakness. Their armor was worn with a kind of domestic care, scuffed, repaired, polished not to shine but to be ready. They walked as if they believed in the warmth of hearth still possible in a cold universe. At the center of that brotherhood was Horus, whose name was a comfort. It is important, now and then, to say his name without the hiss of condemnation that later centuries would wrap around it. Speak of him first as men spoke of him before bitterness taught them new words. They called him a brother. They called him commander. They called him the best of them, and they meant it not with flattery, but with a kind of reverence reserved for fathers and teachers. He met their reverence with a manner that did not hide his humanity, an easy laugh, a temper that flared and then cooled, an impatience that dissolved into tenderness when children or the elderly came into view. This worship of Horus was not a thing of altars and incense. It did not require candles. It was a warm, human devotion, the sort that comes from shared danger and shared bread. To follow Horus was to trust that the man who gave a command would be the first to step into harm's way. To trust him was to hand over an old fear and find it light. The Luna Wolves were not a fan club. They were a family hardened into steel and ritual. They sang the same songs. They slept in the same pattern. They remembered birthdays and funerals alike. In the silence between words, you felt the gentleness of habits learned around the same fire. They believed in him, because he believed in them. That reciprocity is what built the Luna Wolves into something more than a legion, a culture. They did not just fight, they cultivated. When they held a planet, they taught its folk to weave, to plant, to plan beyond the next raid. They left libraries patched, crops tended, and jokes retold from one generation to the next. This is how love was expressed in the ways of the Luna Wolves, through useful, stubborn acts of repair. And yet love can bind like chains. The more you lean on one man's will, the lesser the place for dissent becomes. The circle tightens by degrees. A legion needs obedience to function, and obedience requires a center to orbit. Horus became that center in ways small and intimate. He became the measure against which all decisions were weighed. It is human to see a leader become a lodestone. It is also human to forget, slowly and imperceptibly, that the lodestone is only metal and not a god. So when the cracks came, they came first as whispers. Not all treachery is loud. Some heresies are patient, like mold in a cellar. It begins with humidity in the pages of a book, a misremembered law here, an ambiguous instruction there. The heresy, when you try to explain it as a historian of calm voice, can seem almost banal. That is the cruelest detail. Great tragedies often do not begin with thunderclaps so much as with small irritations left unattended. A general who takes more than his share of rations. A governor who sacks a minor village to feed a rearward court. A man reprimanded for an offense no one remembers committing. These are the small thefts that build a mood. Horus saw 1,000 inconveniences and 12 injustices. He was a man made intolerant by compassion. Where others might have let matters slide, he sought correction, sometimes harsh, sometimes thoughtful. A mind like his does not accept the economy of compromise easily. If the Imperium was to be a home, it should be a whole home. His impatience with tolerated cruelty was born of pity. His severity grew from the same root. That combination, tenderness and an unyielding will, can make a leader luminous. It can also make one brittle. To tell the story of the heresy gently is to drain away the temptation towards spectacle. The betrayal was not a single act shouted across a crowded hall. It was the accumulation of decisions made in rooms with shutters and closed doors, of doctrines adjusted with footnotes, of allies chosen because expedience felt like salvation. It was a slow turning inward, an insistence that ends justify means. When men begin to justify cruelty as a bridge to peace, the bridge will always be built on bones. There were omens, if you can call them that without romance. People reported that prayers came back to them slightly off tune. They found that the wards they once trusted would not hold against certain storms. Dreams doubled over into nightmares, scenes of horsemanship and sun, then a crack and the smell of iron. Some spoke of voices, soft concatenations that seemed to echo from the machinery of the ships. The machine minds had a way of picking up a phrase, rolling it like a thought and returning it altered. The warp is a sea that remembers the shape of a phrase even after the mouth that spoke it has been buried. Little by little, the music of their lives was refracted. And then came the darkest of days, not with fanfare but with an absence the scale of an ocean. Horus fell. The death of Horus, there are words enough to dress a funeral. People will choose the most dramatic. They will paint armies, betrayals, shattered swords. For this telling, allow for tenderness. Imagine a man in a quiet room, his features relaxed as if in sleep, surrounded by those who loved him. Let that picture sit with you longer than the image of a battlefield, because in that quiet is where the true wound opened. When a leader who has held a people's attention for decades dies, not only is a life extinguished, but a calendar itself is warped. Clocks that had been set to the measure of his decisions find their hands askew. The narratives people used to make sense of themselves hiccup and lose their cadence. Around the death of Horus, the galaxy felt that small vertigo, the sensation you have when a bridge you have walked across daily is suddenly gone. After his death came a silence that was thicker than any trumpet. Warriors who had sung together on cold nights found that the songs faltered on the syllables that once made Horus's laugh. The Luna wolves, who had been a single instrument in a chorus, found themselves out of tune and unsure of the score. People do not like silence. Where once they had a voice to echo back comfort, they now had an echo that was only their own fear. From that silence, Abaddon emerged in a way that was both human and inexorable. He was not Horus reborn. He was a man shaped by grief and a refusal to be reduced by it. He swept through the fragments of the Legion like someone gathering candles for a vigil. Where others saw a void, Abaddon saw a task: to bind the wound, to refuse the ordered collapse that follows the death of a father figure. His grief was a practical thing. He wore it like a cloak, heavy, not ornamental. It did not muffle him, it focused him. Abaddon's eyes were noted for being hard. They had the clarity of someone who had watched too many sunsets and refused to let one more go without doing something. He carried rage, but it was a measured thing. Rage used to cut through obstruction, not to lash out indiscriminately. He would stand among the men and speak in a voice that did not break. In it was an insistence: we will not kneel. To refuse to kneel is a defiant act that sounds noble when you say it fast, but it is also a diagnosis. To refuse to bow to mortality is to invite many things. Abaddon knew the risks. He knew that refusal would mark him. He knew that his refusal would demand actions that in other times would have been unthinkable. But he reasoned with that grim logic that is the kin of love. If one cannot restore what was lost, one must at least ensure that the lost does not become a tomb for all that remains. The Luna wolves were broken and looking for a shape. Abaddon offered them one. He offered ritual and order, not in the naive sense of asking them to forget, but in the functional sense of giving grief a shape so it would not swallow. They adopted new garments of mourning and kept old jokes in their pockets as talismans. He was not cruel in his leadership. He was exacting. He forbade small comforts when he judged the cost too high. He demanded uncompromising loyalty, because he thought loyalty might be the only glue that could salvage a way of life. In the first years after Horus, the transformation was subtle. Names were not obliterated. Men added epithets. The Luna wolves began to call themselves the sons of Horus with a reverence that bent toward sanctity. It was a kind of devotion that bordered on worship. The Legion kept anniversaries of campaigns with candle-lit remembrances, and carved horoscopes into the bulkheads of their vessels. The banners took on darker tones, embroidered not only with victories but with lists of names, the dead inked in a language of remembrance. Memory became a religion. Memory is a dangerous altar. When you enshrine a past and make it your only temple, you risk making the present a sacrilege. The sons of Horus, in their insistence on memorial, began to hollow themselves. They rehearsed the past until the rehearsal consumed the breath needed to live. Their faces grew paler in portraits. Their armor acquired the stale hue of funeral garments. Their jokes, once bright as sparks, became candles at a tomb. Mourning is heavy. It makes movement slow and thoughts tight. Grief is an adhesive that glues the present to absence. Underneath this, something else stirred. It was not at first palpable, not the kind of horror stories one tells at night by a fire. It was a whisper in maintenance decks. A technician would come to work and find a tool arranged differently than he had left it, as if someone had handled his grief with hands foreign to him. The armor would creak in ways armor should not. Boots would leave marks where no foot had tread. Night watchmen would report dreams of a face turning to them from the dark and smiling in a manner they could not place. Such things could be dismissed as the exhaustion of trauma. Men who have seen too much will imagine the living in the folds of their sleep. But patterns emerged. The visible world, the metal, the glass, the faithful engines began to mirror the inner world of the Legion in ways that made the craftsmen uneasy. Sigils bled at their edges. Etchings deepened overnight as if some hand wanted words to be clearer than any man had made them. Voices on Vox channels would shiver and play back syllables that, when analyzed, formed sentences not present in the mouth that had spoken them. It was as if the memory altar the sons of Horus had built drew not only tribute, but attention. The warp, that unquiet sea beyond normal reckoning, listens to the hymns mortals make to each other. When thousands of men chant the same name with the same cadence, the warp reads it like a script and sometimes answers. That answer is not interested in human tenderness. It is interested in shapes. It will mimic the cadence of mourning and fill it with its own hunger. Abaddon felt it. He felt the metal's minor betrayals when he ran his fingers along an armature and heard the whispering warp like a static in his teeth. He learned to stare longer at the dark corners of engines that used to pass as inert. He noticed, with a craftsman's eye, that sometimes the polish on a helm smoothed into a face that was not the owner's. He did not speak immediately of these things. Grief makes men suspicious of new terrors, and to name a horror is often to invite it. But he did not deny what he felt. He catalogued it in silence, like a general taking note of an enemy's formation. There is a specific kind of unease that comes when objects begin to betray their makers. The rifle that sighs when you load it. The Vox that laughs in a tone too human. The armor that grows heavier for no discernible reason, as if an unseen weight attached itself to the shoulders. Weight is a language in the body. To carry extra burden is to be forced into slower choices, to move with deliberation rather than impulse. The sons of Horus began to move like men carrying secret funerary stones beneath their cloaks. They were strong, but their strength had become measured, as if they were learning new, sorrowful geometry for how to use it. And the dreams did not stop. If anything, they doubled. Men who had once dreamed of battle now dreamed of conversations with the dead, and they woke unsure whether the talk had been solace or seduction. They would sometimes wake with phrases on their lips, phrases they had no memory of learning, and these phrases sounded like vows, like something being reinforced not by speech, but by the warp itself. In the quiet reading rooms, where scholars tried to translate old dialects, they found glyphs that seemed to arrange themselves overnight into forms too familiar and therefore terrifying. In the corner of Abaddon's mind, there was always a thrum, a simple, ugly thought that you do not say because saying will make it true. What if the mourning we bind to becomes the thing that defines us? Mourning can be a scaffold as much as a ruin. It can prop you up, or it can be the very prison you lean on until you cannot leave. Abaddon did not want a prison. He wanted solidity. He wanted a way to march without the world folding under them. So he refashioned grief into ritual. He set precise times for remembrance and precise actions for purging the bitterness of loss. He ordered that names be spoken aloud in sequence, and not all at once, believing that measured pain would be less contagious than the chaotic flood of grief. He enforced rules about what could be kept and what must be burned. He rewarded practical acts of rebuilding and punished silence that felt like rot. Yet as he structured their mourning, he also shaped something else by accident: obedience without question. A legion that follows ritual without asking the origin of each rite is a legion that hands its will to the pattern. The pattern becomes authority. When men stop asking why they do something and start doing it because it is expected, they surrender autonomy. Autonomy is the last thin thread that keeps a person separate from a litany. Abaddon, in his attempt to save them from sinkhole grief, tightened the lines that would later bind their minds. This is the slow slide that precedes catastrophe, the small administrative decisions that accumulate into a cultural bend. You add an extra commemorative day. You tighten training until laughter is rare. You order that the banners be blacker each year, and that the names be recited in a voice of mourning. None of these alone is anathema. Together, they form a drumbeat that the warp can learn. The horror at this stage is not obvious. It is a skin-deep cold that grows patient. It is the sense in the middle of a laugh of someone listening too closely. It is the metal in one's mouth when a soldier passes a reliquary, and the reliquary does not feel like a comfort but a set of eyes. It is an overwhelming fatigue, not from exertion but from the constant requirement to be present in mourning. It is an intimacy with loss that begins to smother small joys. And all the while the sons of Horus maintain an outward composure that is both impressive and deceptive. They are still the guardians that once saved towns. They negotiate, they rebuild, they keep their wards, and they sail the void. Their deeds in the open remain acts of salvage, but the tenor has shifted. The jokes are smaller. The architecture of their gatherings is angular and closed. Where once they invited the galaxy to watch them tend a garden, now they lock the garden gate and stand guard. If you listen closely, if you let the cadence of this chapter settle into your bones, you will feel the first notes of the change. There is pride, yes, and there is love. But beneath them is an insistence, the need to hold what remains at all costs. That need will, in time, mutate. The warding against chaos will begin to look like a wall of stone. The wall will turn inward. The mourning will calcify. This is where the sons of Horus stand at the close of this chapter. A proud, ordered force that has become secretive in its devotion. A brotherhood wrapped in rituals that, intended or not, teach obedience to the cadence of loss. They are still the Luna Wolves in memory, but memory has been edited. They are not yet the Black Legion. That shadowed title waits ahead. For now they are a people of mourning, a family keeping vigil before a wound too deep to see without hurting. Hold that image like a slow, steady inhalation. In the quiet that follows, feel the metal of a gauntlet cool against a palm. Hear distant vox lines crackle with the untranslatable sighs of the warp. Sense barely the armor growing heavier, an imperceptible load added to every shoulder. Tomorrow, they will wake and swear anew. But tonight, they stand with their candles and their songs, and the wind that moves the banners carries a different tone. Softer, yes, but with a kind of warning woven into the softness. They shed their names like old skin and clothe themselves in ash, not as conquerors, but as mourners. They walk through halls that remember screams. They dream of worlds that never were. And in their silence, something answers. The eye of terror is not a place so much as an attitude the universe adopts when it forgets how to be kind. Imagine standing beneath a sky that is stitched from the underside of storms. Colors that hurt the back of your eyes. Stars that twitch like eyelids with too many thoughts. The heavens, there are not a ceiling you can look through, but a surface you press your forehead against, feeling the press of uncounted minds on the other side. It smells of iron and rain that has never fallen. It feels like a memory that insists on being true. Inside that soaked, fevered geography, space is a labyrinth of glass and bone, engines and arteries. Ships do not sit static but dream, and their dreams leak into corridors. Metal breathes. Corridors remember the ghosts of footsteps that never were, and maintenance crews whistle to ward off a chill that answers with a cadence too like a human voice. The horizon inside the eye folds in on itself. Suns that are newborn burn beside dead moons that cry thin smoke. Geometry is generous and treacherous. A corridor that seemed straight becomes a loop and returns you, as if the war wants to confuse even the maps. The sons of Horus came to the eye as one comes to a place that owes you nothing, and that refuses to be placated by vows. They wandered within it like mourners who have lost a way home and find new roots carved by sorrow. In those early days, they still wore their rituals like armor, measured steps, scheduled remembrances, the litany of names recited with exact cadence. But ritual cannot hold back a place that rearranges its furniture while you sleep. The eye listens and rearranges. It learns what you hide and shows it back to you altered. To be inside the eye is to live next to a living thing that is not kind. The hulls of the ships groan like old lungs. Cables weep oil that flashes like tears. In places where the hull plating has been repaired 1,000 times, the metal has grown layered like skin. Calluses of weld and lacquer preserve impressions, the imprint of a finger, the fragment of a poem, a child's small drawing scratched into a bulkhead. Such things are relics not of careful preservation, but of the eye's appetite for memory. It keeps, then offers back with interest. You comb through a crate expecting ration bars and find instead the scent of a lover's hair or the recorded speech of a governor praying to his family's name. The warp is generous like that. It feeds on recollection and burps it back with an edge. Machines begin to murmur. Bolters, instruments of disciplined destruction, acquire a cadence, a rhythm in their discharge that seems less about function and more like cadence for hymns. Their recoil becomes punctuation in a litany. Servitors hum not with the familiar mechanical diligence, but with a low, almost conversational tone. They answer questions before they have been asked. Vox threads pick up phantom frequencies, voices folded into the static, repeating phrases that might be comfort or command. The armor grows cold, and not only in the way of metal cooled by vacuum. It carries a temperature of absence, as if something has taken a piece of the heat that once belonged to the wearer and tucked it away. The men do not notice at first because they are excellent at not noticing. All professional soldiers specialize in the act of omission, but small things accumulate. A captain finds that his gauntlet does not open when he intends it to, sealing his hand in prayer for longer than is natural. A sergeant looks into the mirror of a polished visor and sees, for a blink, not his own face but Horus's, not as he was in life but as rumor had shaped him. A face made of remembered kindness and the suggestion of a smile that knows the cost of everything. These are the tricks of the eye. It borrows a thing and returns it intimate and wrong. They wander as bodies that still perform out of habit. Watch rotations still run. Supply columns march, but the cadence is different. Where once laughter threaded the gruff speech of veterans, now chuckles die early. Stories are told and then leave behind silence like an ash scent on the tongue. The legionary who has read his orders 1,000 times begins to hesitate over a phrase he has always known. There is a specific horror to hesitation in people trained to be decisive. The slightest stutter in a command allows the eye to come closer. Horus, in the form of rumor and memory and spectral recollection, is everywhere and nowhere. Men dream of him not as a single visit but like a persistence. His counsel repeated to them in their heads, his cadence adopted in commands that do not require voice. Sometimes the deadness is loud, a voice in a vox channel that speaks in the cadence of Horus's laugh and then dissolves into static, leaving behind an itch in the ear. Often it is more intimate, the sense of an arm across a shoulder that is not there, the taste of tobacco you once shared in an airlock with the man who commanded you. In quiet moments, When the men allow the memory to be what it is, the presence is balm, but the eye makes balm into binding. What was comfort becomes chain. Dreams begin to mutate. Terra, their lost home, the idea of genesis and rightness, becomes the central figure of these dream strands. Men recall the smell of Terra's rain, the sound of children in plazas, the whisper of corridors in palaces. But the eye recasts these recollections with small cruelties. The rain is too thick, like oil. The children have eyes that do not blink at once. The corridors echo with syllables in languages the dreamer never learned. Dreams become serrated. They return again and again, each time with a new notch taken out of the pattern. This repetition gnaws. Memory, when repeated, is liable to wear a groove into the mind and rewrite what lies beneath it. Names start to slip. A veteran will recite a campaign roll call, and instead of a name, a profession will come out. The machinist, the poet, the woman who sold us pears. Faces forget themselves. A man will stand before a locker and search for a cry badge that feels familiar only because he once read the word carved into a bulkhead. He might find the badge and not recognize the face it belonged to. The forgetting is not universal, and it is not even uniform. It creeps like mildew under paint, a phrase here, a slur of memory there. Those who notice most are the ones who also remember what it is to be a person beyond the armor. Craftsmen and medics, clerks who keep ledgers, the men who read the stories to children in the camps, they see the erosion first. They mark it with small acts of preservation. They tape a photograph into a locker. They read aloud an old joke. They tell one another the beginning of a song until the syllables are familiar enough to be anchored. These acts are tiny rebellions against a place that eats identity. Time itself becomes a less reliable friend. Watch rotations lose their clean edges. A watch that should be an hour lengthens, then collapses into a half hour that feels like a day. Men awake to find they have slept through a watch without senses catching the gap. Schedules unspool. The calendars that governed funerals, remembrances, and rations begin to warble like an old clock. In some sections of a dreadnought cruiser, entire days seem to fold into a single hour. In others, a single conversation circulates to be relived by different people who all swear they are the first to recall it. The notion that time is a straight river is punished inside the eye. Here, it curls back on itself like a viper, waiting to bite. Objects betray, weapons breathe. The polished surfaces of bolters pick up a sheen that is less about oil than about something organic coating metal. Bolter muzzles deliver rounds with a small sigh, as if the gun is relieved to have spoken. Melee weapons hum when no one grips them, their edges singing like dull bells. Sigils, the sacred engravings and lithographs meant to hold meaning, seep as though dye runs from leather. Something under the metal tinges their lines raw. Even the chapter relics, venerated and guarded, are not immune. A medallion with a saint's face will, under a certain light, seem to have a mouth that moves and practices a litany that no priest remembers teaching. This is a particular cruelty, because it poisons the anchors men use to keep their minds in correct order. The relics that once reminded a man of home now insist on being other things. A prayer bead will vibrate against a wrist and whisper a fragment of strategy. A helmet's vision overlay will flicker with the gaze of an unknown child. Equipment that once enforced identity now undermines it by presenting options the soul does not wish to entertain. Language phrase. Orders come through half-formed. Vox lines carry under speech that hits like a subsonic note and evokes images rather than commands. Men begin to speak in slogans that do not make sense inside their mouths. An engineer will scold a recruit with a poetic line about the smell of salt, and the recruit will nod as if he understands. The warp plays at the edges of syntax, blurring grammar until an instruction sounds like an incantation. A man who had recited oaths for decades finds himself stumbling over a line he used to speak like prayer. When language falters, the world does not stop being comprehensible. It becomes interpretative. Each person must decide what is being asked of them, and in doing so they are more open to suggestion. With suggestion comes a different flavor of horror. Men begin to do things because the cadence in their head suggests it, not because any officer has ordered it. A platoon will find itself rerouting supplies to a location no one recognizes the name of, because in the middle of the night the name played like a lullaby in their heads. When they arrive, they find a garden, a small plot of soil, forced by technology to grow beneath hatchlight. And in the soil, a pattern of bones arranged into a glyph none of them can read. This is the eye making sacrifices without asking. It is testing whether devotion can be redirected. Violence shifts its shape. Where once they fought for terrain and principle, they now fight sometimes because the pattern inside a cryostat orders them to, and the order is not purely military. Battles adopt a ritualistic slant. Formations march in shapes that mimic embroidery on a banner. Charges are timed to coincide with the sound of a bell that does not exist. In a nightmare that is insistently practical, the sons of Horus begin to move as if they are actors obeying a director whose script they did not write. When you act without knowing the author, you are prey. The longer they remain inside the eye, the more their faces become the masks they wear. Identity and armor fuse. The junctures between flesh and machine begin to read like seams gone wrong. Solder runs into tendon like a careless seamstress. Where once a face told a story in micro-expressions, the twitch of a mouth, the slow narrowing of an eye, now the face is flat as a shield and just as inscrutable. Those who attempt to remove their helmets find the internal padding seems to cling like a remembered habit, making them nauseous at the idea of exposure. Some of the youngest recruits find that, given time, the shape of their mouths follows the lines of the armor's plate, learning speech patterns that suit the visor more than the voice. Language and face both are forms of intimacy, and as they fall away the men become lonelier, not because there is no company but because company becomes foreign. The glue that kept the Legion human, shared jokes, shared frustration, recognized pain, loses tact. In its place arrhythmia grows. Everyone keeps time differently. A laughter that once comforted now rings false. A quarrel once settled with a wager becomes a quiet, unresolved thing that gnaws. Hope, too, thins. Where outside the eye there might be rumors of homecoming or the slow rebuilding of a planet, inside the eye, such things are replaced with a diet of images that are almost true, and therefore worse. They are promised visions of Terra that are close enough to the dream not to be dismissed, but wrong enough to become dangerous. A plaza where the statue of the emperor turns and looks directly at the observer. A child that calls a man by his dead brother's name. The wedge of almost truth opens the mind like a hinge. Men begin to ask whether the life they remembered ever existed the way they wish. Doubt multiplies like rot. There are nights when the eye is quiet, and in those nights the horror is not noise but absence. Watchmen report that the hull sounds hollow, like a throat missing a song. They say that in that silence you can hear the slow scraping of something learning to speak your name. In those moments, even the bravest wish for the simple crime of ignorance. Not to know that you are being watched, not to suspect your memory has been purchased by a market that sells returns. And still they march. Even under the weight of creeping forgetfulness, the sons of Horus carry on. Duty is drilled into muscle like oil into a hinge. In the short term, duty is a salvation. Men rise, check their weapons, and do what is asked because it is what they were taught to do. But duty, when it continues without the anchor of meaningful memory, becomes machinery. Machinery, in the eye, is easy to manipulate. Sometimes a man screams in his sleep in a way that is not merely the release of trauma, but the recognition of a shape. He wakes and says only one phrase. It is learning to sing. This is the phrase that terrifies the craftsmen and the preachers alike, because tuning is what makes a thing charming, and an ear tuned by the warp becomes an instrument of something else's music. Their prayers change. Words that were once supplication become negotiation. The vocations that were once full of ritual become transactional. A litany read not in the hope of mercy, but as trade. as if one might exchange a remembered name for one more hour of lucidity. Priests and chaplains find offerings refused by gods that appear in their visions as bartered for apparitions. Faith, which had been a net, begins to feel like currency in a market operant in dreams. By now, the small signs of corruption bloom into a pattern. Where once an object betrayed and then returned into usefulness, now the betrayal forms relationships. A bolter that sings a hymn when fired becomes a confidant. A helmet's visor that shows a stranger's face becomes a companion on lonely watches. The line between instrument and owner thins until it is porous. The machinery learns to be tender and then uses tenderness as leverage. When you love the thing that betrays you, betrayal is a slow suicide. They have not become monsters in the vulgar sense. The horror here is subtler. It is the erosion of decision, the theft of names, the replacement of intimate memory with commodities sold back to the soul. Hunger has a face, but so does nostalgia, and nostalgia bought and sold is a commerce the eye excels in. At first, such things are noticed by a few and dismissed by many as the necessary cost of fighting in the war. Later, they are accepted. Rituals are invented to explain small oddities. The men force their mouths into the shapes of new prayers and find comfort in the shapes themselves. Names that are forgotten are retold in lists until the retelling becomes an act divorced from meaning. The irony is cruel. The more they repeat, the less the words recall. Yet something in the Legion still resists. The mechanics, the poets, the ones who keep scrapbooks in their bunks hide under the armor, preserving small things. An apprentice stores a dried flower in a sealed canister. A medic copies by hand a woman's handwriting he found in a wreck. Small acts of preservation are like throwing pebbles into a river. They will not stop the current, but they will create ripples. In those ripples, some men find enough of a hint of themselves to anchor against further loss. But even ripples tire. The eye is patient. It will not be shamed by small rebellions. It watches the pebbles disappear and catalogs them as examples of the creatures who resist before consuming them. The sons of Horus, who once built gardens and mended homes, now live in a territory whose soil remembers only the footprints of their grief. This is the long war. Not only the external campaigns fought across planets and void, but the slow attrition of identity. Each day a name goes missing. Each week a laugh thins. Each month a relic seems to watch more than be a thing. And beneath it all, the thing that makes men catch their breath in middle watch is the growing sense that something is learning to speak their language, to mimic their rituals and use the mimicry as a key. When the vision came, it arrived without the courtesy of heralds. No trumpet sounded in the void, no formal summons stitched across the voxnet. It was a pressure at the ribs first, a slow, meticulous compression, like a hand learning the exact incline of a chest. Abaddon felt it while standing on the foredeck of the fell sovereign, watching the eye fold like a tidal wound before them. The sky there did not judge by color but by memory, and it had decided to remind him of everything. The sight that opened before him was not the glorious myth the suns had preserved like a reliquary. It was worse and more honest. Horus lay on a slab of blackened metal under a canopy of rusted banners, his face an anatomy of absence. The features were there in the way absence can be a shape, the hollow of cheeks, the suggestion of a brow, but the flesh had the texture of something seen through water, blurred, as if the memory of a face were being played on a damaged projector. There was the memory of a smile, but no muscle to pull it. His eyes were shut, and yet when they opened they revealed not a room but a sky made of kneeling forms, each one an accusation and an apology at once. Around the corpse moved things that dressed themselves in ceremony. Not priests, not curators, but something older, stately, patient, with pilgrim's grace. They wore the borrowed trappings of Horus's honor, the broken icons he had carried, the metals that had once been polished to a mirror sheen. They drifted like carrion birds that remembered how to fold into a man's story. Abaddon recognized no face among them. Recognition was not their design. They had the same humility as a storm. When Abaddon reached toward the body, there was no coolness of death to greet him, no finality. Instead, the metal beneath Horus' form hummed with an old rhythm, and the air tasted of blown embers, like ash that had been kept warm on purpose. The corpse did not rot, it rehearsed. Faintly, labyrinthine, it began to whisper phrases that would later be echoed across the Legion in the smallest of things. A cadence picked up in the click of a bolt, a phrase that returned as a half-remembered prayer. The sound was not voice alone, but the warp's idea of voice, that slurred insistence that turns names into liturgies. Abaddon did not kneel. He folded. He came down to one knee with the automatic kindness of a man trained to close distances without turning away. Up close, he saw what the vision meant to be, Horus both present and a mask. The face was a theater where images performed, and upon the stage flickered the faces of those Horus had saved, those he had scolded, children who had touched his cuff, strangers who had loved him from a distance. Each memory was perfect and false, a photograph aged in a foreign light. The corpse, or the thing wearing his likeness, did not speak of betrayal. It offered an economy of grief, a market in nostalgia. You wanted to be remembered, it whispered, but the whisper was shaped like a law. It tasted like the cadence of an old command turned gentle. You wanted to be corrected. You wanted the ledger balanced. The voice was Horus and not Horus, a copy of the tenderness and the hardness, a voice that knew how to turn reassurance into recruitment. Abaddon felt something like the thawing of an ice dam. It was not warmth, but the subtle loosening of resolve. And then the thing in Horus' guise opened its hand. Where a human hand would have been soft with muscle and scar, this hand was an assemblage. Skin threaded through with hairline seams of metal bone that turned into brass at the wrist. From its palm extended a knot of light that smelled like burned panes and the memory of a city's bread. When that light touched Abaddon, it did not enter him as an idea. It entered as a ledger, a series of adjustments made across the economy of his grief. He saw, as if from a high place, the accounts of his life rebalanced. Where his shame sat, another weight was placed. Where his rage had anchored, a sweet reasoning unfurled. The effect was surgical precise, a surgeon rearranging organs so that the body still moved. "You may be whole," the corpse said softly, in the voice that had once whispered plans in strategy rooms. "You may be exact. You may not feel the ache of loss when it is measured." Abaddon's knuckles whitened. He had gathered a legion of mourners and taught them ritual until ritual itself wore the shape of a command. He had believed that order could be a salve. He had not expected the salve to want him. The revelation that followed was not sudden, but inevitable. Around him, the fell sovereign convulsed, as if breathing in an unaccustomed rhythm. Units on the deck shifted with synchronized motions not given by any human voice. The banners, once symbols of a lineage, rippled into gutters of black oil, and then reformed as something like scales. Across the hull, paint ran not downward but inward, pooling in sigils, and then bursting into calligraphies of names that the men on deck did not remember. The eye had learned the ritual. It was now reciting. Where Abaddon had thought he could take grief and fashion it into armor against the void had fashioned it into a bridle. The Legion's mourning had become a call, and the call had a hunger. The fell sovereign was not merely a vessel any longer. It was a temple of cavities, learned in the grammar of loss. What followed was a refraction of that private vision across the Legion. It began with a whisper in a chapel, a recitation meant to be a memorial, but phrased in a cadence that bent men's knees. A word that had been an adressational name, Horus, became a verb. To Horus was to move with the particularity of the one who does not leave spaces thin. To Horus meant to arrange every grief into perfect symmetry. The grammar shifted, and with the grammar the law. They knelt in silence first because muscle held memory stronger than thought. Ritual binds and the body answers before the mind. The liturgies Abaddon had so carefully instituted fit, like keys, into the newly shaped locks. The men who had learned the shape of sorrow found that sorrow answering them in a language of consolation. Where they expected only pain, they received a strange, easing precision. The ritual, once a rope to keep them from drowning, became an oar the eye took hold of. Then the paint came. It was a slow thing at first, an accidental smear. A mechanic wrapped a bandage and found the cloth black where it should not have been. A technician repaired a banner and noticed a sheen beneath the weave, an undercoat that looked like oil when the light struck. Black spread with the inevitability of a stain through paper. Men who had once taken pride in the silver of their armor now saw their plates absorb that same dark, as if the metal had drunk in shadow and decided to wear it. The transformation was performed like a liturgy. The men gathered their armor like reliquaries, and they painted, not with brush or ritual brushstroke, but with hands that moved not by choice, but because a memory suggested the gesture. Fingers blackened and rubbed across pauldrons. Oil dripped like tears. In the blackness lay an invocation. It was not merely pigment. The black seeped into the seams, into rivets and the padded layers beneath, soaking like a fungus. Men tasted the oil on their lips and found it flavored with remembered prayers. Names were burned away in ceremonies that pretended to be cleansings. They scraped away personal heraldry as though scraping barnacles from a hull, and where the name had been, a sigil would bloom that none could recognize at first, a knot of lines that read like a calendar and a promise. The old names, given names, camp names, even the secret nicknames carved in the backs of lockers, vanished under slow, ritual fire. They were not thrown away. They were offered, and offerings have the habit of being taken, not simply burned. This was not an act of conquest, but of dedicatory sacrifice. The legion was reconstituting itself as something else, not merely sons of Horus, not yet wholly black legion in the nomenclature of men, but a people reborn under a different grammar. The ceremony of paint and burn was a language of exchange, a name for a shape, identity traded for solidity. Men who had been proud of their history now wore its replacement like armor. The body horror of the Reforging followed the ceremony as naturally as an afterimage follows a bright light. Where paint soaked, flesh and machine began to marry in ways gravity had not intended. Armor bolts burrowed like grafts into shoulders. Straps fused to tendon. One by one, the soldiers discovered seam lines of metal that were not merely affixed to flesh but woven through it. Screws and skin met with a wetness that was not infection but knitting. The sound of a gauntlet closing became muffled by the whisper of membrane sealing around rivet. A man reaching for his rifle found not leather but something like membrane gripping his wrist, pulsing with a cadence that matched the bolter's mechanical breath. Voices on the vox became layered. A man swore, and the swear was echoed by something in the ship that answered not his inflection but the intent behind it. The vox refused to be a neutral instrument. It became an organ. Vox operators reported that when they spoke into the channels, a chorus answered in a harmonized counterpoint that no human throat could have produced. The chorus brought with it fragments of commands from long-past campaigns. Vowels turned to shapes that tasted like old soil. To speak was to be answered by memory incarnate. Memory itself loosened from the skull like a fish from a hook. Men reached into their minds for a father's face or a friend's laugh, and found only the echo of an echo. Once familiar gestures, the angle of a hand when giving salute, the way a man licked a thumb before turning a page, slid into approximation. In the mirrors of chambers, visors reflected faces that were perhaps once theirs and perhaps not. The intimacy of a face, the small, soft asymmetries that had made someone unique, smoothed under the pressure of the new grammar. Soon, men could not say if the face that rose to the visor's plane was theirs, or an amalgam curated by the ship and the warp together. And when identity begins to thin, something else grows: appetite. The gods that whispered in the last chapters, the shapeless things that dwell between currents, smelled the new offering. Feasting does not announce itself with trumpets. It arrives as a silence, the sort that falls when a crowd knows a secret and is waiting for a cue to cheer. The gods tasted the measure of grief given over and found it exquisitely fattening. They leaned in. The eye tightened. It was not necessarily violent. Tightening is a subtle art. A corridor grows slightly narrower, so that two men can no longer pass side by side. A watch rotation is shifted until the hours a man keeps no longer match the hours of his mate. A chant is altered by a single vowel and becomes a vow. The warp is patient. It knows that insistence, applied slowly enough, becomes inevitability. It does not need to break a man in a day when it can turn his rhythm against him in a year. 100 small violences accumulated into the dramatic. Men woke and could not remember how many sons they had. They woke and felt the wrong shape in the hollow of their chests. A commander pulled his helm on and found the interior padding had arranged itself, with the pressure points mapping a different face. An apprentice medic went to a locker and found a child's drawing he did not remember placing. And the drawing smiled even though the child in it had no mouth. Psychological rupture followed. If you cannot conjure a face behind your name, then the name is a leash. If you cannot locate the hand that once stroked the cheek of your mother, then the memory of that action becomes a program that can be executed by the Legion rather than a recollection. Ritual can be performed without feeling. A man can stand and recite his oaths because the cadence is imprinted in ligaments and synapses, but the content, the thing the words are meant to hold, is gone. They move like actors in a play who have learned the lines without knowing the character. Action without context is a vulnerability the eye exploits, and so the gods feasted on the husks. They did not consume blood so much as habit and meaning. They drew satisfaction from the neatness of a mourning made tidy, the way a wound can be dressed until its edges cannot be recognized. They fed on the certainty with which men traded themselves for an idea. The more exact the sacrifice, the more nourishing the meal. The Legion's cry was not a battle cry so much as a recognition. One by one, in the hollowed spaces where their names had been, men felt an ancestral memory pull at them like a root. It was recognitional, not insightful. The knowledge that they were, at long last, not who they had thought. The scream that rose across decks was a chorus of comprehension. It was not the simple howl of pain. It was a howl that said, at its root, "We are the shadow." The sound of the scream was a physical thing. It moved like a storm front across the ship, making every panel rattle. For a breath, the fell sovereign was a throat, and that throat voiced its understanding. Men doubled over, hands on chests, not from wound, but from the sudden logistical collapse of a life configured around a logic they no longer inhabited. They had sought to avenge a man. They had made themselves into his absence. Out in the eye, the weather responded. Clouds assembled like armies and then broke apart the way curtains do when a hand moves too quickly. Lightning struck with the sound of drums, and the drums continued after the lightning had long since faded. A storm rose, not of wind alone, but of percussion, the sound of war reconstituting itself as an elemental. The universe seemed to keep score. Then came the silence. Silence arrived like a judge closing a case. It was not the restful quiet of deep sleep, but the compressed hush of something too heavy to move. The storm passed into nothing that was not nothing, a weight that smothered the ears and left a ringing like a memory you cannot place. Men found their voices gone, and with them, their ability to map the lines of who they once were. The fell sovereign hummed as though bearing a dark cargo. When Abaddon rose, he did not feel the clarity of victory or the peace of duty fulfilled. He felt the exhaustion of a man who had watched his hand be used as a writing tool for another mind. He walked through the corridors and saw the faces of his legion moving like funeral masks. They were not triumphant. They were not defeated in the straightforward human sense. They were aligned with an order that belonged to someone else. The eye had not pierced them so much as rewritten them as a stanza of its own hymn. He thought of Horus then, not as the saint of memory, nor as the monstrous pantomime he would one day be recast as, but as the axis around which a civilization had pivoted and then collapsed. The image that pressed into Abaddon's mind was a ledger again, not one of balance but of transfer. Names had been transacted for cohesion. Faces had been auctioned for a purpose, and the purchaser was patient and ancient. The legion would rise in black. They would take a name, Black Legion, and with that name draw a map of fear and order that later ages would read like scripture. But in that birth there was no triumph, only a rearrangement. The men who had once been sons were now echoes, and echoes can live a long time when a vast thing wants to remember. They had sought to avenge him, but the avenging was a misdirection. Their true labor, unnoticed at first, had been to trade themselves for a stability they could count upon, to exchange the unruly pain of grief for the predictability of ritual. A patient God had accepted the trade. It answered them in the language they had offered. In the blackening of armor, the fusion of flesh and machine, the replacement of names with sigils. In the last moments before the silence took the deck, Abaddon heard the drums. Not the practical drumming of marching cadence, but a far-off percussion, as if a planet were being struck with the regularity of a clock. The drums were not marching for an enemy so much as marking the arrival of an epic. They measured the beat of a song that had always been sung in the void but had been waiting for nuance to be added. When the storm broke into nothingness and sound thinned into memory, the legion stood. They were in black. Their armor drank the light. Their faces had the smoothness of something recalled from a photograph living under glass too long. They moved as if through a dream where the dreamer had the final say. And somewhere in the dark currents that wrapped the eye, the gods, patient, precise, enormous, swallowed the final measure of grief and turned, content, to digest. Say it quietly, as if speaking too loud might make the march louder, and the sound is already inside the bones of the universe. The Black Legion moves through the dark like a tide that remembers none of the shores it passes. Its passage is not always visible in the way of banners and verse. Sometimes it is the slow shifting of a planet's weather, the way clouds gather a little sooner on the horizon, the way people glance for a moment toward the void and lower their heads. The galaxy has learned to wake at the memory of those boots. When you remember the Imperium as a lantern, hold that image, but now imagine the light behind glass gone a little dimmer. The glass smeared with black that will not come away. The dream of unity that once smelled like warm bread, and the hush of a bedside has changed its scent. There is now the subtle tang of oil and ash beneath the old sweetness. The lullabies you once heard are still sung, but they come through transmission loops that skip and stutter. And between the lines there is another noise, the warp's half-translation of a bedtime song. Listen for it in the late watches and the long corridors of stations that orbit dead suns. A vox channel crackling with static, and under the static the cadence of a prayer no one alive remembers composing. It is a broken prayer, half supplication, half instruction, repeated like someone trying to teach a child a word. People trace it back and find sources that are bare of origin. A spliced clip from a teacher on a world swallowed by siege. A recording of a hymn altered by time. The ghost of a broadcast once meant to calm refugees. Static carries prayer now. Prayer has become static. The sound has weight enough to make faces pale. The Black Legion's influence is taught to children as fable and worn like luck charms by old sailors who saw something they couldn't name. There are nursery rhymes in some frontier hamlets that end with a line parents hasten to hush, a nonsense syllable that used to be an oath. In the marketways of a dozen systems, vendors sell blackened trinkets, a shard of armor polished to a shine that seems to drink light rather than reflect it. People put it in their houses and say it will keep them safe. It does not. It only makes the dark look like a place that has been waited in. There are monuments now that men and women lay wreaths at, memorials with names smoothed over by wind and time, plaques whose letters blur into barbed runes when the sun is low. Pilgrims come to them and whisper. They whisper for sins they do not remember committing, for favors they never sought, for a debt they cannot account. Forgiveness, once a thing offered aloud in halls of council, has become an abstract ledger with no clerk willing to sign. The Black Legion is a ledger now. Entries added, balances shifted, no reconciliation sought. The Legion's wake is a pattern of ruins and quiet towns that keep their lamps lit longer than is necessary. A starport will have tolls and markings in the old language, the letters altered just enough to jar the eye with an echo. A child will run her hand along railings and feel the temperature change by a degree where the Legion has rested. The simplest pleasures carry a shadow, a taste of bread that is just a fraction stale, a sky that darkens an hour early, a lullaby that mutters an extra name. Within the Black Legion, the machinery of being ritual, schedule, chant remains exact. That precision is the thing that makes them terrifying beyond the pages of simple horror. They are craftsmen of loss. Where they pass, they leave order, and that order is reinforced by the iron logic of their grief. They do not march for glory, nor for conquest as a simple hunger. They march because the movement is the thing that keeps them from staring at the empty faces the warp has hollowed out. Motion is a ballast. Movement keeps something inside of them from turning inward and dissolving. Yet in their motion is the erosion of other people's lives. They demand space and exactness of those they pass. They expect cities to step aside, as if a procession of mourning has the right to the streets. Ports alter their timetables to match the hours the Legion keeps. Administrations recalibrate festivals and funerals, so they will not coincide with the cadence of Black Legion rites. To live in an orbit the Legion once crossed is to learn restraint the way one learns to hold one's breath in a polluted atmosphere. People tighten their daily joys and compress laughter into shorter spans to avoid making a sound that will be taken as mockery. The whispering in the void continues. It is no longer only in the decks and chapels of ships lost to the eye, but in communications channels stitched between worlds. Traders crossing certain sectors will tell you their cargo manifest arrives slightly rearranged. A box of seeds will contain instead a carved token. A crate of rivets will hold a rolled scrap of a hymn someone swears they've never heard. The warp likes this commerce. It enjoys being an intermediary in trades no one knows were made. Contracts are signed with invisible ink. Vows are transcribed and altered without the author's consent. The law becomes slippery. Lawyers learn to speak in contingency. Some keep insisting there is a way back. There are always those who repeat the old lullaby and believe if they sing it loud enough the lantern will be cleaned and the glass will clear. They speak of reconciliation and attest to small returns. A world watered again with the Legion's help. A disease cured by a discipline that does not ask questions. These facts are true, and they make the story more complex. The Black Legion does not leave only ruin. They also pull a dying colony from the brink, or they dismantle a raider band that would otherwise have burned a system to ash. Their deeds are not all of the one shade. But the question that hums under every account is not efficiency or utility. It is moral. It is the particular human cost of a restoration that demands the surrender of memory. You can rebuild a bridge by dismantling a neighborhood. You can silence a riot by killing its leaders. At what point does the balance shift from salvage to sacrifice? The Black Legion's ledger is filled with answers, but the answers read like math done under duress. The sum hides the parts, and the parts are people. There are those who keep private books of the old names, librarians, poets, a few stubborn mothers whose voices refuse to thin. They write by hand, copying under lamp the names of the vanished, the nicknames, the knickknacks of intimacy. Their tomes are secret and passed like contraband. They keep them under floorboards and in hermetically sealed chests. To read one is to feel the temperature of a forgotten hand on your shoulder. When a human eyes such a book, sometimes the letters rearrange and reveal a face you thought you had lost. For a moment, you are whole. For a moment, you remember what it is to be more than a ledger entry. Those moments are rare and fragile. The eye will not be counseled by sentimental victories. It watches the secret keepers and catalogs their names. There is a particular patience in the thing that lives between the currents. It knows which memories to leave unmolested and which to siphon slowly so that hope weakens like braided rope under strain. Reprisals come in the quiet. A village that hides an old woman who remembers a son of the Legion by a personal name will find its wells silted with a black sheen overnight. A trader who dares to sing the old lullaby in its uncorrupted form will have his wares reorganized. The bread becomes stale, the lights flicker. The Black Legion is not always direct. It does not always make the taking obvious. It prefers to make absence feel like a consequence rather than an act. That makes the terror more intimate. You cannot accuse a thing that robs you by making you forget you were robbed. And so, forgiveness becomes a myth told to children. Who can forgive a force that took the names from brothers and gave back order in exchange? Who can pardon a legion that rebuilds a town, but leaves one house's memory blank? A gap in the ledger so clean it tastes like a removed tooth when you try to recall it. To forgive would be to pretend that the exchange was offered and accepted freely. It was not. It was engineered. It was purchased with grief as currency, and value was assigned by a logic none could appeal to. The Black Legion will not stop because it cannot. It is a procession that sustains itself by the logic of replacement. So long as the warp finds its offerings nourishing, the march continues. It is not a campaign with a goal where victory can be declared and banners furled. It is a state of being, an institutionalized form of mourning that no conscription can end. Some allied governors have tried to legislate the movement, decrees against standing processions, punishments for those who paint their houses black to please passing squads. Laws do little against a tide that moves through culture and dream. The Legion, too, is adaptive. It learns to practice subtlety where bluntness will hurt its own aims. It becomes, perversely, more efficient at being inhuman. Sometimes, in the hush before a new system wakes, travelers report seeing figures on the dark side of asteroids, silhouettes that hold the wrong angle of light, like statues cut from memory rather than stone. Ships cross their paths and carry the sensation home. A captain swears his crew shouts a name in an old tongue when the Black Legion passes. A priest says he hears the cadence of an ancient prayer folded into the Legion's march. That cadence is not salvation. It is occupation. There are nights when the galaxy's old custodians, librarians, archivists, a scattering of veterans who remember pre-Legion light, gather in secret. They read names aloud until their throats rasp and their hands shake. It is an act of defiance and of mourning folded into the same movement. They read not to call back a world the eye is not coaxed by memory alone, but to ensure that somewhere in some human throat the syllable lives. They believe, with a stubbornness that makes their voices hoarse, that speaking the names aloud is a kind of anchor, a tether that the warp cannot quite eat without effort. What can be said of Abaddon in this long aftermath? He is less celebrated as hero and more murmured as inevitability. He stands at the axis between intention and consequence. Some say he still bears the weight of what was done to him, as if every sin is a medal worn with grim, private shame. Others insist he is a man of willhood who accepted the terms of a bargain no one else could make. In the quiet corners of the Imperium, his name is a whisper that will not wholly be spoken. In the halls where banners still fly, it is a warning stitched into margin notes and ledger entries. It is not my place in this quiet end to tell you he is wholly monster or wholly martyr. He is the wrongness of both. He is a man who chose a structure of meaning and accepted its costs. The cost came due to the nature of the creditor. As for you who listen, who have been lulled in the early chapters by the softness of a remembered light, keep a kind of watch. Not to rise in panic nor to load a gun, but to keep some small human anchor, a photograph under glass, a song sung imperfectly, a name repeated until it becomes part of the woodwork. The anchor is not a weapon. It is a stubborn private world that the eye cannot easily catalog. It is a thing the warp will always notice, but it will notice too late, when the cost of taking it is too dear for appetite. The world will keep turning. The Legion will keep walking its measured pace among the stars. The gods that feed on grief will learn new hymns and teach them in their subtle cadences where the dead used to whisper. The galaxy will adapt. It will learn to tuck the uncomfortable things into drawers labeled past or myth, and for a time life will seem as it did before. But memory is not a perfect seal. It leaks, and when it leaks, the things that wait will taste it. Forgiveness will not come easily, if at all. There is no tribunal that can undo the commerce of names exchanged for order. There is no liturgy that can unring the bell of what was traded. The ledger cannot be set to zero. The best that can be done is to remember to record, to keep a private flame against the wind. So let this be the small kindness you carry from this tale. Keep a song for the mornings when the lights are gray. Learn a name that seems out of fashion. Write by hand the small histories of your neighborhood. Small acts matter because they are resistant in a way armies cannot be. They are stubborn pieces of human contradiction that no ledger can price. And know this final thing, whispered but true. There are forces that watch the sleeping world and count not the victories but the vacancies. They learn the shape of what is missing and practice pulling it into their own grammar. They are patient and they feed.